What do all these people have in common, other than being royal, of course? The answer is that they were all spares who became heirs, then ultimately took the crown. The men were never meant to be king, the women were never meant to be queen, but all made it to the throne nonetheless through a combination of early deaths, the occasional revolution, and even an abdication crisis. Some were ambitious and had sought the throne out, even stealing it from other members of their family with a better claim than their own. Others were people who unexpectedly became monarchs and were reduced to tears at the thought of taking on such a responsibility. In today's video from History Calling, I'm going to share their stories with you as we look at the houses of Tudor, Stuart, Hanover and Windsor, and hear about some of the people who unexpectedly became monarchs. If you're not familiar with the phrase the heir and the spare, it is used to reference the direct heir to the throne before they have any children, and whomever is next in line should anything happen to that heir before they are able to produce any offspring. The spare is not someone who in the normal course of things would become monarch themselves. In other words, the current Prince George is not the spare to his father Prince William because George is already in line to become monarch someday. The current spare is in fact his little sister, Princess Charlotte, just as their uncle, Prince Harry, was once the spare to Prince William. Oh, and if you're wondering, yes, it was the publication of Prince Harry's memoir, Spare, which inspired this video, as it got me thinking about all the spares who have been born in the royal family over the past 500 years, who have gone on to take the throne. The reason I'm limiting myself to just the past half millennium, roughly speaking, is that prior to that, the rules around inheritance were a lot less strictly defined, and the idea of who the heir really was more open to debate. Quite often, it was just whomever was able to grab the throne and hold on to it, and so the concept of who the true spare was also more fluid. It's therefore much easier to pick up at the start of the 16th century when male primogeniture was becoming a lot more accepted and respected. And if you're unfamiliar with it, male primogeniture was the idea that boys inherited first according to birth order, and only if the male line was exhausted did females come into play. I'm also not going to cover every single spare to heir story, as some of them involve the deaths of very young children who were only heirs for very short spaces of time. I'm just going to look at the best known and only for English, later British history. The first of our spares to become heir is also one of the most famous, Henry VIII. Born in 1491, Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, to give him his earlier title, was the second surviving son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and it was his older brother, Prince Arthur, who was meant to be king. In April 1502, however, less than 5 months after his marriage to the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, 15-year-old Arthur died of an unknown ailment at Ludlow Castle, and the 10-year-old Henry found himself the new heir to the throne. He was duly given Arthur's title of Prince of Wales, and when Henry VII died in 1509, Prince Henry became Henry VIII. This wasn't the end of the Tudors' dynastic struggles though, for as you may well know, Henry VIII fought for decades to produce a male heir of his own, and along the way he became the father of not just one, but 2 spares himself. More unexpectedly still, they were both girls, and they were both initially born as heirs. Before I get to their story, if you're enjoying this content, please give it a thumbs up, and to get more history delivered straight to you without having to remember to constantly pop back and check my channel, hit the subscribe button beneath this video and switch on all notifications so that YouTube automatically notifies you every time I upload. You can also find links to my social media and Patreon sites below, where I'd be delighted to have you join me as well, and where I share additional History Calling perks, including behind-the-scenes information and early access to ad-free versions of my videos. Henry's oldest surviving child was his daughter Mary, born to his first wife and one-time sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon. Mary's journey to the throne was messy, to say the least. Born a princess of England and heiress presumptive to the throne, meaning she was heir until a legitimate brother was born, she remained in that position until 1533, when her father completed his abandonment of her mother, had their marriage annulled, and Mary declared illegitimate. Her position as heiress was instead taken by her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, born in September 1533 to Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was in turn barred from the throne, however, after her mother's fall and execution in 1536, when she too was declared illegitimate. When their father finally had a son, Prince Edward, in October 1537 by wife number 3, Jane Seymour, it looked unlikely that either girl would ever wear his crown. Jane died soon afterwards, though, and despite 3 further marriages, no more little half-siblings were forthcoming. In 1543, these 2 sisters therefore experienced a highly unexpected reversal of fortune when their father used an Act of Parliament to restore them to the line of succession behind Edward and any children he might have, though this Act of Succession didn't become law until 1544. Mary was now the spare, and when Henry died in 1547, she moved up to the position of heir to Edward, with Elizabeth now in the spare position. Still, Edward had survived infancy, generally speaking the most dangerous time of life up until old age in that century, and it seemed rather unlikely that either sister would become queen. That, however, is exactly what happened. Edward died in 1553 at the age of 15, Mary ascended to the throne, and when she died childless too in 1558, the first Elizabethan age began, when the woman who had been a princess for less than 3 years of her life and who had been at the bottom of the pile of potential Tudor heirs unexpectedly came out on top and took the throne. For the next story of a spare who became an heir, we move on to the Stuart dynasty and to the 17th century. Elizabeth was succeeded by her distant cousin James VI of Scotland in 1603, and at that time the heir to the throne was his eldest son Henry, born to James and his wife Anne of Denmark in 1594, and who was created Prince of Wales in 1610. The spare at this point was James's second surviving son, Prince Charles, born in 1600. England was on course to have King Henry IX, but there was an unexpected upset in 1612 when Prince Henry died of typhoid fever, aged only 18. His place as heir was now taken by his brother, and when James I of England died in 1629, he was therefore replaced by this son, who became Charles I. If you've seen my video on what happened to Charles I's body after his death, you'll know that things didn't end well for him, as he was deposed, then executed by the parliamentarians in 1649. By then, he had produced 3 surviving sons, however. The eldest became King Charles II, though it was 1660 before he was able to return from exile in mainland Europe to claim his throne. The second, who had been the spare until their father's death, was Prince James, Duke of York. Once Charles I was dead and Charles II proclaimed king, James became the heir. The third son was Prince Henry, who died in 1660, just a few months after his eldest brother had retaken the throne. Charles II had a prodigious number of children, but unfortunately none of them were by his wife, the long-suffering Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza. That meant that his heir remained his brother and one-time spare, James, who became king in 1685 after Charles's death. By his first wife, Lady Anne Hyde, James had produced a considerable number of children too, but only 2 daughters, Mary and Anne, survived. Both these girls went through periods of being the heir and the spare during their youth, because James and Lady Anne Hyde had several sons. However, none lived more than a few years. Nevertheless, during the times when these little boys were alive, they displaced their sisters in the line of succession. Lady Anne died in 1671, and in 1673 James remarried, this time to the Italian princess Mary of Modena. She too produced numerous children during the 1670s and 1680s, but as of 1688 none had survived, leaving James's daughter Mary, now the Princess of Orange after marrying her cousin William of Orange, as the heiress presumptive, and her sister Anne, who was the Princess of Denmark through her own marriage, was the spare. Then, in 1688, everything changed. In June, Mary of Modena gave birth to a healthy baby boy, James, Prince of Wales, and he immediately displaced his half-sister Mary and bumped her and Anne down the line of succession. This would have been galling enough for 2 women who had by now no doubt become accustomed to the idea that they would both one day be queen. Princess Mary hadn't been able to produce any children, so Anne knew she would likely ascend to the throne. But worse still, these two sisters had been raised as staunch Protestants at the insistence of their uncle Charles II, while their father, James II, had converted to Catholicism and intended to raise their new little brother as the same. So what did they do? Well, they pretty much stole the throne. Now, I have a whole video on how Mary and Anne went about getting their father's crown before he was even dead, and in spite of the existence of a legitimate male heir, so I'm just going to give you the abridged version here. Anne, along with many others it has to be said, put out that her little brother was not in fact her little brother, and that he was instead a changeling, smuggled into Mary of Modna's birthing chamber in a warming pan. Yes, you heard that right, a warming pan. Princess Mary and her husband/cousin William of Orange supported this idea, and by the end of 1688 some panicky English nobles, who were now staring down the barrel of a new Catholic dynasty, wrote to William and essentially asked him to take the throne. He did so, and he and Mary, and she was the one who actually had the stronger blood claim on the throne, became joint monarchs, while King James, Mary of Modena and their son fled to France. This series of events became known as the Glorious Revolution, and it completely reshaped the English succession and led to a law barring Catholics from holding the throne. Mary II, as she now was, died of smallpox in December 1694. William expired from complications following a riding accident in 1702, and Princess Anne, who just like Elizabeth I had once seemed unlikely ever to sit on the throne, found herself the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. We now pass from the Stuarts to their successors, the Hanoverians, who came to the throne in 1714 after Anne died with no surviving children. The first three King Georges were pretty good at producing children, and it was 1817 before the family had a succession crisis. In that year, the ailing George III was still king, and his heir was the Prince Regent, the future George IV. The Prince Regent had only one legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, but she and her son tragically died in childbirth in that year. Her father was still the heir, but the spare was now his brother, Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, a guy you've probably never heard of because he's one of those spares who never made it to the crown. George III died in 1820, the Prince Regent became George IV, and the childless Prince Frederick became heir to the throne. The spare was now their younger brother, Prince William. Frederick died in 1827, making William the new heir, but he and his wife Adelaide had no surviving children, and so the role of spare was now taken by the young daughter of the next brother, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, who'd actually died back in 1820, and her name was Princess Victoria. By now, you can probably see where I'm going with this. George IV died in 1830, his brother became William IV, and Victoria moved up from spare to heir. When William died too in 1837, she became queen. Victoria lived until 1901, and with her husband, Prince Albert, the Prince Consort, she had 9 children, all of whom survived into adulthood and had children of their own. So in her hands, the succession was safe for quite some time. But in 1892, there was an upset to the expected line of descent. Victoria's eldest son, and therefore her heir, was the future Edward VII. His eldest son was Prince Albert, Duke of Clarence, with the role of spare being held by Edward's second son, Prince George. In late 1891, Prince Albert got engaged to Mary of Teck, and all seemed set for a grand royal marriage and the production of the next generation of little princes and princesses. Then, in January 1892, 28-year-old Albert died, having succumbed to pneumonia brought on by flu. There was no major succession crisis, though, for his brother George inherited his claim to the throne and his fiancée, marrying Mary of Teck in 1893 and becoming King George V in 1910. It was all very Prince Arthur, Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, but with a happier ending for everyone, except of course Albert. It was George and Mary's eldest son who would cause one of the greatest scandals to ever hit the royal family, and produce the most recent instance of a spare having to take over for an heir. This son was called Prince Edward, born in 1894 and known as David within the family. His next younger brother, and therefore the spare, was another Prince Albert, born in 1895 and known as Bertie to his relations. Edward inherited the throne in January 1936 after George V's death, and Bertie moved up to the position of heir. But no one seriously expected that this shy man with a stammer would ever have to be king. It was instead assumed that King Edward VIII, as he now was, would put his playboy days behind him, marry a nice English girl, and become a father. Not so. The love of Edward's life was an American divorcee named Wallis Simpson, and his determination to marry her, which was incompatible with his role as head of the Church of England, led to him renouncing the throne in December of that same year and passing it to his brother. Bertie, who took the regnal name George VI, was in such a state of shock and misery at the thought of having to take this job on that when he told his mother what was about to happen, he, and these are his words, broke down and sobbed like a child, which is really saying something, as the Dowager Queen Mary wasn't known for being all warm and fuzzy. Bertie did an admirable job of helping to steer the country through World War II, however, and after a successful reign, he died aged just 56 in 1952, passing the throne to his eldest daughter, Elizabeth II. And that's the story of the not inconsiderable number of spares who have ended up on the throne over the past 500 years. I think it just goes to show you never know what's coming. Thank you as always to my wonderful patrons and to those of you who support the channel by using the thanks button underneath videos. If you enjoyed all this talk of kings and queens succeeding to the crown, why not try my coronation playlist next to continue your historical journey? And let me know below which of these spare to heir stories is your favourite and why. I'll be back next time with a new video, and until then, keep learning.